revolution have been reimagined and presented in the classroom. So we've got a number of speakers for this session. We're going to start off with Robin Whitburn and Abdul Mohammed. So Robin Whitburn is a lecturer in history education at University College London Institute of Education. He and Abdul founded Justice to History, which is an organisation to help teachers and students explore relevant and often neglected diverse histories. They recently led a Historical Association Teacher Training Fellowship on Britain and transatlantic slavery, and they've presented a variety of different webinars for the HA on diverse histories and decolonising the curriculum. Abdul's a co-founder of Justice to History. He also worked as a history teacher in London and internationally. He's a PhD student at UCL, affiliated to the Empire, Migration and Belonging in English Secondary Schools project. So this is a partnership between the Institute of Education at UCL and the Department for Education at Oxford. It aims to support teaching and learning about the history of the British Empire and its complex, often contested legacies within British culture, politics and society today. So I'm going to hand over to Robin and Abdul for their session.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that introduction, Kate. And yeah, thank you for putting together such a wonderful program today. It's been absolutely fascinating from beginning to now. So yeah, that's sort of who we are, Robin and I. I mean, you mentioned the Slavery Fellowship. Time flies. What, that was 2019 now. We're on to the second one, looking at the economic history of colonialism. But today, really what we're going to talk about is sort of a snapshot of our journey in trying to find ways of teaching the history of transatlantic slavery better, and putting together a sort of a coherent approach for teachers in that vein.
Oh, I'm trying to make the... Yeah.
So yeah, just an illustration of, you know, some of the challenges that people who want to see slavery taught better in English schools face was sort of clearly displayed in a sort of a discussion on Twitter a few years ago. So a teacher, in all earnestness, asked what order they should teach these three. They're not compulsory, but they are widely taught to the point where they are de facto sort of compulsory: the Industrial Revolution, the British Empire, and transatlantic slavery. And a lot of the responses seem to sort of ignore what we all understand, you know, and have been learning about today, which is this centrality of slavery to Britain's national story, you know, in sort of the post 17th century world.
Yeah, it's it was interesting. You can't imagine anybody asking this question: in what order should you teach English Civil War, Glorious Revolution, English Reformation? It would be a no-brainer. You'd almost like fail your PGCE as a history teacher if you asked that question, because it's ludicrous. Why isn't it obvious that you have to start with transatlantic slavery? It mystified me.
I mean, a brief history of it is that slavery had been taught, as it was actually in the national curriculum, but it was always taught as American history. And it's only really in the last sort of 10 years that people have started to approach it as a part of British history. So the main course that was taught at Key Stage 3 was called the Black Peoples of the Americas, and it starts with sort of, you know, slavery in the 13 colonies and the Caribbean, but it ends with civil rights, and that was the narrative that school children really, the diet of you know, transatlantic history, slavery, that the school children were fed until very recently.
So we've been involved in trying to make a difference, and as you said, Abdul, we go back to 2019, and we were privileged to join with Dr. Nick Draper and Dr. Katie Donington from at that stage with the UCL LBS project in leading this teacher fellowship, this kind of 6-month program in which 15 teachers dedicated themselves to learning about how this topic of Britain and transatlantic slavery could be taught better in schools. One of the first things we did was to say, what are the principles? Not so much what should the lessons look like, but what should the history actually be all about?
Yeah, and in that we were sort of inspired by the work being done on Holocaust education, where, you know, another very sensitive historical subject, which had a tradition of being taught quite badly at times, and a lot of the scholars, teacher educators in particular, working in that field, crafted principles, pedagogical and curricular principles that, you know, could then be used to become the foundation of good practice. And, you know, working with Nick and Kate, you know, this is our sort of attempt to do something similar for transatlantic slavery.
And you can kind of group them in different ways. But so we were saying, if you wanted to teach an inquiry that is a sequence of 6-7 lessons about transatlantic slavery and British history, including industrialization, what would be how would you organize them in a sense chronologically? What principles would you start with even before you do that work?
Yeah, so I mean, it seems very obvious to us, but that the story, or the first encounter that young people have with the history of people of African descent should not be, you know, with them in chains. And so I think, you know, something that's well accepted and understood now is that the story of people of African descent begins with Africa before slavery, and that could be sort of West African kingdoms. It could be any number of topics. Something else which is much harder to pin down, but we recognize was a barrier to sort of teacher development in this area, was a recognition that the teacher and who they are, and them coming to terms with, you know, their relationship and their sort of understanding of this history is essential. And we sort of loosely term that the positionality of the teacher, and it's sort of an ongoing process that one has to work on. Yeah,
because I think, yeah, that there are two things that hold teachers back in teaching this history. One is the knowledge, and that's the same for all topics. You know, there's always something more you can learn, and the evolving historiography of any topic draws you in to learn more. So you, in that sense, subject knowledge meaning history subject knowledge. But I think, especially with topics like this, there are other aspects connected to the history, and you can see two of them there straight away. Well, three actually: race, gender, terror and violence. These are major socio-political, economic constructs and concepts that require more than the discipline of history to understand. They're the disciplines of sociology, psychology, and in that sense, this topic really exemplifies the fact that I think that history is an interdisciplinary subject, and in all, particularly those issues of race, gender, terror and violence, they connect with the person of the teacher as well as the knowledge of the teacher. So what's been your own work that you've done on issues of gender and race? How do you see violence and protest and activism? How do you view that? So we see there's a lot for the teacher to do. Then all of those,
it was already an area that was sort of fraught with difficulties, and I think that we have to sort of acknowledge that, you know, the last 4 or 5 years where, you know, we've been sort of pulled into this culture war has complicated it further, and teacher knowledge becomes even more important, because that's the only real sort of defense that teachers have against those kinds of attacks.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, as you say, Abdul, I mean, these things have always been troubling for teachers because they recognize how much work they need to do, and how much more troubling they are now, where they fear that if they were to actually pursue authentic history that goes into these issues, they might be that teacher that gets, a double spread in the mail, and is vilified and pilloried by populist politicians. It's challenging for teachers, but not only is the knowledge of a kind of curricular nature, but also it's of a pedagogical nature. That is, it's not just what you teach, it's how you teach it. So you could have all of these really rigorous, historically verified sessions about transatlantic slavery, but if you don't think about how the young people are going to be able to interact with that, are they going to be able to talk about it? How can they be actually engaged in this history if it only involves rote learning and testing on so-called facts? They've got to be engaged in dialogue, and the information, the ideas need to come not just from books that list the 5 factors, but actually voices, people from the past who have actually written and communicated their ideas. And so sources, particularly African voices, become really important in the history. And then also, you can't just teach slavery without thinking about abolition and legacies. What happens afterwards is important. But just another question comes, as to, there was that question about what order should you teach them, but also what is the kind of bigger picture in which you would teach this history? You were saying, Abdul, already that the kind of default position was teach this as a part of the Americas. So you include slavery, and then you're going to move through into the American Civil War, and then you're going to go on to Martin Luther King. And that's the big picture that you're going to use. Other people did think about teaching this as part of a big picture of slavery itself. Like, let's go back to the Roman times and let's do a big picture of slavery. But I think our thoughts were that it tends to dilute the essential British nature of this history and what's going on. And Catherine Hall was talking about this, has talked about it a lot. And we particularly with teachers, we've used part of a speech she made at the Troppin Museum in the Netherlands, also part of her article on doing reparatory history. And there, particularly, I was struck by this comment: Britain's domestic history has been systematically demarcated from its imperial history, as if the two had nothing to do with each other. And so, where you're saying slavery, empire, industrial revolution, as if these are 3 different dimensions, an American one, an imperial one, and then a British domestic one. And actually all of these things interconnect together. They are essentially a British one. And so, all the calls to teach more British history, we say yes, but what does that mean? So that's where we would, our work, we would place transatlantic slavery in the intersection between British history and the history of peoples of African descent. But also, it can play a part in other thematic studies as well: global capitalism, environmental change. But this is where we think, certainly, like children in year 8 typically learn this at school. It would come as British and African intersection. So as well as the idea of what the bigger picture is, we use this concept of core knowledge and hinterland knowledge, using the work of Christine Council and also Jonathan Grande, who've done blogs about this in the last couple of years. It's very helpful to make a distinction, especially when people go on and on about knowledge and knowledge-rich curricula, to distinguish between really essential ideas and then supportive information. What are the core aspects? And our thoughts are that lies with our principles. If you want to know what the core knowledge for teaching Britain and transatlantic slavery is, each of our curricular principles gives you that core idea. So in race, for instance, the construction of ideas of racial difference and the racist practices of societies in the Caribbean and the United Kingdom, they come from the processes of transatlantic slavery. Under terror and violence, the dehumanizing brutality of transatlantic enslavement from the trade voyages to the plantations. These are essential core ideas that the students need.
So two history educators doing research in Northern Ireland in the early 2000s sort of crafted a typology that tried to explain how teachers there in the sort of post-conflict society dealt with sensitive history, and they sort of grouped the teachers into three groups: the risk takers, and I'll explain why. You know, in order to teach as well, one needs to be a risk taker. But the container, and the avoider. And then obviously the avoider is a group of teacher who I think we can all recognize, somebody who doesn't want to do this and feels uncomfortable, doesn't feel it's important at all. But the container is somebody who crafts, positions this history within, I don't know, a disciplinary approach, or puts it within a thematic account to minimize the aspect that you see listed here, the core knowledge, that is quite uncomfortable. Talking about race with young people is challenging. The describing and exploring issues of terror and violence, these require a profound level of empathy, knowledge, and sort of trust with your students. So yeah, you have to be a risk taker in order to reach the core knowledge. It's not easy.
Absolutely. And in terms of like the hinterland knowledge, you could choose all manner of different things to teach the hinterland knowledge. That is, you've got the core ideas. What are going to be the stories, the events, the places, the people that you're going to be able to use to get to that core knowledge? And one of the principles that we've recently added to the list since 2019 is this principle of specificity. Because we're very concerned that, in fact, Nick, Kate, and both of us are very concerned that so often American examples become the hinterland knowledge to get you to these core ideas. And there's no real need for that. You look at a number of schools, they're teaching Nat Turner's revolt as the example of resistance. And they could so easily replace Nat Turner with Sam Sharp on Jamaica and the Christmas revolt of 31 to 32, which is so much more integral to the British story. And so, yeah, just a very tight connection between what you choose, the examples you choose to teach, and the core ideas that you want to get across. And I think we're going to be running out of time. So what I suggest is that we skip through. We've got much more that people can look at. They can find all this eventually in a few weeks on our website. But just to introduce you to some additional thinking that has inspired us in the last few months. We had the privilege of sharing a conference with Maxine and Pat early in January on their work, and we were inspired by their ideas of the more global connection, the whole idea that Indian textiles were critical to the British commercial transatlantic trade. And then we saw this recently at the Entangled Pasts exhibition at the Royal Academy, the work of the Singh twins, this piece, the Andean, the extended triangle, which we're developing at the moment into into a scheme for students where they take apart all the different elements of this incredible picture that conveys these ideas of global history, global economic history. I think that's our time. We're trying to keep time.
Well, we went 5 minutes over, but yeah.
Oh, I need to stop sharing. Is that?
Thank you very much. Yeah, sorry, it's unfortunate that we've had to be so brief in our presentations today, but otherwise it would make for quite a long day. So thank you very much for introducing us to those principles and ethics in the classroom. I think it's really important part of how we conduct these dialogues and learning when we approach histories of slavery. So that's been really, really interesting. So we're going to move on to the next presentation, which is our final one of the day. So if you could pop any questions for Robin and Abdul in the chat, and we will move on to our next presentation, which is with Matt Stallard and Rohan Shah. So Matt Stallard is a research associate at the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery. He focuses on database development and innovative digital techniques to reconstruct personal and community histories of enslavement. He's also worked as a project manager on many aspects of the Centre's public history collaborations, including co-leading on the Global Threads project, which you've already heard about, and the Black Industrial Revolution project, which you're just about to hear about. And Rohan Shah is a teacher in London, and he was a project researcher for the Black Industrial Revolution project. So I'm going to hand over to Matt and Rohan for the final presentation.
Thank you, everybody, for a brilliant day so far. And I'm crossing my fingers that this screen sharing is going to work. And I'm assuming and hoping that you can see our presentation on my screen.
We can see that. Thanks, Matt.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll just set my timer going. Thank you. So yeah, I'm Matt Stallard, and I'm based at the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery at UCL, joined by Rohan, who KE has just introduced, who's worked on a number of public history projects with us and is a current history teacher at secondary level in London. And by the magic of video, we're also going to be joined today by Ashley Jones, who's our other team member on the project. She's a researcher and archaeologist at the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, and we'll hear from her as well. So you may well be most familiar with our centre through our database of financial legacies from compensation and slave ownership. We've had over 3 million users across the world over the last 10 years, and it's obviously one of the leading public history resources in the UK, but we have a much wider remit in terms of looking at more than just the financial legacies, but also cultural, social and public narratives around the legacies of slavery, with particular focus on uncovering details of enslaved lives and experiences and community stories. And there's a little selection here of our kind of more recent partners and projects that we've been doing. So the Industrial Revolution, we've been exploring today, obviously, and it's a concept that's so familiar and ingrained in the national psyche and in education and in heritage. And within that standard narrative, there's a number of aspects that this project aims to challenge, to develop and to augment. First, from a curricular perspective, there's a certain British exceptionalism that comes from a focus in curricula on our island story that can easily elide or ignore the global and colonial links and aspects of Industrial Revolution that we've been talking about today. Moreover, in that focus on the uniqueness of the UK becoming the world's first industrial nation, we've got a tendency to focus on stories of innovation, the genius of British inventors, the refinement of the scientific method, and as well as those entrepreneurs and engineers, we often will look at the story of the industrial working classes and find some pride in the grit and the gristle and the grin and bear it and the solidarity and organising of communities. both of which aspects are transformational and well worthy of interest. But there's obviously that much wider global story that they are important aspects within. Now, you might be wondering, what are these images here on the screen for? Well, they're here to do that job of troubling these assumptions. On the left-hand side, we've got an illustration from the 18th century of Roaring River Estate in Jamaica. And on the right-hand side, we have an image that people might well be more familiar with, which is of Coalbrookdale at the same time. Similarly, here on the left, we have another image of Coalbrookdale at the birth of the Industrial Revolution, as we might call it. And on the right, we have Good Hope Plantation in Jamaica. Now, what we really wanted to hook you in and show with these images is that industrial infrastructure, particularly of the boiling houses and the production and processing of sugar on plantations across the Caribbean. You can even in this image, you can see, as well as the chimneys and the smoke, a large aqueduct that's been built. So we really want to get across how the Caribbean plantation system was at the forefront of industrialization and very much pictured and described that way by observers. Real quick run through some of the historiographies, and people, if they are familiar at all with the global connections of the Industrial Revolution, it's likely to be, as we've touched on this morning, through that triangular trade, the movement of raw materials, markets and investment in industry, first highlighted by Eric Williams, but also the idea of the plantation as a site of industrial production in its own right has a long historiography going right back to C.L.R. James in the 1930s. The idea of factories in the field, the industrial type of labour and the enforcement of strict time and labour discipline on the plantation being a forerunner and a concurrent economic and labour system to industrialisation. And at the bottom here, for a number of decades, scholars have detailed the spread and use of industrial machinery in the Caribbean as being a really key component of the wider British Industrial Revolution. The work of Lewis Nelson recently has been really important to us. So while we can make quite a good fist at resituating the Caribbean in its rightful position in industrial history, we're aiming to do much more than that with this project. Taking a provocation from Stuart Hall's essay, Whose Heritage?, where he talks about the heritage capitalised and the importance of being able to see oneself within that heritage to feel that you belong and that it belongs to you. Black Industrial Revolution also draws upon scholarship of Black science, technology, skills and innovation to highlight the long history in archaeology of complex metalworking across West Africa, examples of which you can see selected here, and then drawing that over towards the Caribbean and looking at what Barry Higman calculated as the 10% or more of enslaved people who worked in craft and skilled occupations, not just on plantations, but in urban and port settings, and looking at the work of Candice Goucher and more recently Jenny Bulstrode, highlighting detailed case studies of highly skilled Black metallurgists in the Caribbean. So Black Industrial Revolution is creating an education resource pack where we're thinking very much about our remit to aim at students and teachers in both the Caribbean and the UK. And what we want to do is accessibly communicate the role of Caribbean people and people of African descent in the Industrial Revolution. And taking the spur from Stuart Hall, we aim to embed more holistic narrative of the Industrial Revolution that highlights innovative and skilled roles of people of African descent in science, innovation, craft, and industrial labour. So I'm gonna, if the technology works, show a video from our researcher, Ashley. So please shout if you can't hear this video in a couple of seconds.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Jones. I am a freelance archival research assistant and an assistant archaeologist with the Jamaica National Heritage Trust. This presentation focuses on the Jamaican leg of the British Industrial Revolution project. To collect the data that I'm sharing with you today, 3 main steps were followed. I reviewed published literature on technological advancements during the plantation era. conducted a survey of local primary and secondary curricula and syllabi, searching for opportune moments for the integration of thematic material, and finally, conducted a review of approved textbooks for relevant subject areas to ascertain the depth of knowledge presently taught to various age groups about enslavement, Black innovation in the Caribbean, and the impact of those innovations on the regional sugar industry and the British Industrial Revolution. This review of local curricula and syllabi shows that there is a strong representation of Afro-Jamaican history in the curricula and syllabi used to educate Jamaican students at the primary and secondary level. A review of approved textbooks and curricula, however, shows that there is room for more updated information on the character of the enslaved and their contributions to the success of the sugar revolution in Jamaica and the British Industrial Revolution. What this could look like for grade 5 students learning from the social studies curriculum is a deconstruction of the general stereotype of the character of an enslaved person. At their age and educational level, grade 5 students are introduced to the enslaved person as a laborer, which is a gross simplification of what historians know to be true of enslaved people on plantations, that many were highly skilled, enterprising, and according to Dr. Jenny Bulstrode, innovative. An attainment target like recognize the contribution of individuals and groups who have helped to shape Jamaica's development over time, facilitates a revision of this simplification. It provides an opportunity to characterize these Afro-Jamaican ancestors as knowledgeable, skilled, enterprising, and innovative. Correcting this narrative allows us to associate positive and technical traits to enslaved persons and paints at this early educational stage a picture of Black scientists in the minds of students. Furthermore, when we contextualize that information by teaching other truths, such as the fact that the sugar industry was heavily dependent on not just a large enslaved labor force, but also enslaved technical know-how and skill sets, we really communicate and acknowledge the weight of the contributions of the enslaved community. In a lesson plan, what this could look like is building upon what Jamaican students have already learned about sugar plantations and simply integrating a lesson on the technological aspect of plantation life. This lesson could incorporate activities that allow students to engage with the history of Black science and technology behind the sugar industry. Visual aids, postcards, illustrations, current photographs of technology and present-day landscapes, as well as field trips to museums, historical and archaeological sites like plantations, and perhaps even maroon towns, and engaging activities such as asking students to build models of innovations, make class presentations, and researching how these technologies work, are useful for educating about the innovative character of the enslaved. In pictures and illustrations, students observe enslaved persons interacting with this technology. By visiting museums, plantations, and building models of plantation technology, students get a sense of the level of expertise required to build and operate sugar works, structures, and keep them functioning in a successful multinational industry. Furthermore, as students use history and scientific methodologies to execute activities in the lesson, there is the added benefit of potentially generating an early appreciation for history and science, which could increase Black representation in historical and scientific spaces.
So you've heard there from Ashley, and then to take us through to the next stage, we should have Rohan.
Hi, my name is Rohan, and I'm the other research assistant. I'm Ashley's counterpart, working primarily on the UK side of things. But for the last year, I've also been, as Matt said, a trainee history teacher on the Teach First scheme at a secondary school within a multi-academy trust in Croydon. And it is this classroom experience, alongside conversations with experienced colleagues, and of course, the feedback we've received from teachers, that I feel, or at least hope, has really guided our work and our priorities while designing and refining the learning resources that we're aiming to produce. And one key takeaway from this feedback, as the quotes on the screen, rather more eloquently illustrate, is that teachers are looking to draw connections across the curriculum, especially in ways that diversify the overarching narratives that they're weaving. And that's confirmed by historical association research conducted in 2021. And accordingly, when considering where within the curriculum to pitch to hook our learning resources, it made sense to first go for Key Stage 3, when, for those of us operating within the multi-academy trust sphere, the Industrial Revolution and the transatlantic slave trade are most likely taught. So for my school, that is the end of year 8. And our aim is to give teachers the opportunity, the flexibility to adapt their existing inquiries and incorporate some of these new contrasting Black Industrial Revolution perspectives in ways that build on their current material. Ultimately, the hope being that by establishing more diverse narratives around innovation in STEM, and especially promoting greater awareness and celebration of Black innovation in history, we want pupils to see how enslaved peoples, how migrants, their lives uprooted, consistently shaped the trajectory of Britain's Industrial Revolution and subsequent innovation. And equally, we also want pupils to start questioning why these narratives have been and often continue to be obscured. Next slide, please. However, the same Historical Association report also highlights areas where progress remains to be made at Key Stage 3. For example, recognition of the industrial nature of Caribbean plantations and of the roles of enslaved people beyond the manual labourer remain limited. And to understand why, you only need to look at these images on the left, which I took from Key Stage 3 BBC bite-sized resources on the transatlantic slave trade. And the narrative is one of enslaved people toiling in the field, performing back-breaking labour in cruel, in brutal conditions to produce resources for British consumption and manufacturing, which is no doubt a vital component of this story. But meanwhile, the industrial dimension of plantation life is situated quite literally and metaphorically in the background. That middle image, taken from a bite-sized resource on the Scottish National 5, is the only one to directly acknowledge some level of industrial development on sugar plantations. Yet, as a foundation for Black innovation history, to understand the influence that the Caribbean had on Britain's industrialization through the skill, through the ingenuity and the entrepreneurship of Black peoples alongside their physical labour, it is essential that pupils can conceive of the environment, the surroundings in which these people existed. So foregrounding these realities for pupils who likely won't ordinarily recognise them is central again to the learning resources we're putting together on the UK side, foregrounding, as you can see, those images on the right side there. And then finally, Matt, final slide. The snippets on the screen from a draft of our learning resources hopefully reflect that aim, those aims of ours. The stark contrast between representations, between depictions of Caribbean plantation and its industrial realities are highlighted. I can testify that the images serve as a powerful hook, much as Matt attempted to use them to hook your attention earlier at the beginning of a lesson to capture pupils' attention and to encourage engagement. For example, when I showed them without any captions to one of my Year 9 classes who studied the transatlantic slave trade and Industrial Revolution last year, the vast majority of pupils still fell into the misconception that the more industrial looking scene on the left must be from a factory in England, when in fact it is from a sugar boiling house in Antigua. The boiling house is at the centre of the narrative we're trying to weave, an environment in which enslaved labourers perform skilled, perform specialised work and maximised efficiencies, working in harsh and dangerous conditions to produce a commodity, sugar, that became the most valuable in European trade at the time. But awareness of that vital role of the boiling house within Caribbean plantations remains limited among pupils in the UK, which is one of the areas that we're seeking to change. Additionally, and finally, our resources also reflect a desire to embed the idea of Black histories within wider historical narratives, such as the Industrial Revolution, such as transatlantic slave trade, rather than introduce them out of context in potentially tokenistic ways, such as for Black History Month. And that, to us, that reinforces the idea that these are shared histories for everyone to be aware of, rather than Black histories, and especially in schools in diverse areas such as the one I teach in, where a significant proportion of pupils are from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds. Pupils are often asking to study Black history. For example, I've been asked many times when we're going to do something special for Black History Month by my pupils, perhaps at their wits' end studying the power of the monarchy. But the opportunities presented by embedding Black histories and building more diverse overarching narratives, centered in this case on Black innovation, seem to me to be far greater. That's my time. Sorry for running over. It's been really lovely to share our project with you. I'll hand back very briefly to Matt.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rohan. All I will do to wrap up is give you this little sneak preview of what the contents of this in education resource pack is going to contain, and I'll leave you with our little launch slide. I'll pop a link into the chat so you can sign up to be the first people to access that resource when it goes live. Thank you very much for your time, everybody.
Thank you so much to both of you. That was really, really fascinating. I particularly found it absolutely fascinating hearing from Ashley, because so much of our conversations about education centre on what's going on in England, or if we're feeling particularly inclusive, maybe the UK, but very rarely do we look to places like Jamaica to see what's happening there, and to listen to people who are involved in the education system there. And actually, it's really refreshing to hear those perspectives represented in your talk. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Holly, who is going to take questions from the chat.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you so much for your talks. They're really, really interesting, and there's a few questions generated from them. And so the first question is for everyone. So I think maybe, I don't know, maybe if Abdul and Robin, if you could take it on first, and then Matt and Rohan secondly. But it's just about how students have responded to this kind of treatment of histories of slavery and industrial revolution. So I wonder whether you have any feedback from students for any of these, we're teaching of the two things in combination, how they've responded to that.
I mean, the simple answer is no, we don't at the moment, because it's very recent that this is happening. I can only say in terms of, so my work is mainly with trainee teachers, and so trainee teachers are responding very positively. But I couldn't say in terms of the classroom at the moment.
No, I'll just echo what Robin said. There is certainly an appetite amongst teachers, and we're seeing teachers, particularly teachers who are vocal on social media, developing new sort of schemes of work that include that sort of this connection. But it really has only been in the last year, I think, where that momentum has started to build up. So hopefully we'll start to see some really interesting work going on in the classroom. But I think it's part of a broader move towards making the teaching of slavery more rigorous, and sort of adding that dimension, I think is only going to be a good thing.
Thanks. I don't know if Matt or Rohan want to add to that.
as we have a actual secondary school teacher in the room, I'll pass on to Rohan to see what your experience has been.
Hi, cheers, Matt. I mean, to be fair, like Robin and Abdul say, I can only kind of speak on a teacher side, and I mean, there'd probably be, heartened to know that it's a very frequent conversation in our staff room and things like that, and something that teachers across the board within the school where I teach are looking to incorporate into the classroom within the kind of constraints of exam specifications and the constraints of multi-academy trust centralized curriculums wherever possible by adapting lessons. And I think the picture I get is that on a wider kind of national scale, the same is happening, that teachers are responding, especially at the Key Stage 3 level, where there's a bit more scope to incorporate some of these ideas. But in terms of the impact that it's having on the classrooms and how pupils are receiving it, unfortunately, I don't have much to add.
Thank you. There's a question here about, and I think again it's for all, it's for everyone. But I think Abd and Robin, you did mention, I think Robin, you mentioned a kind of difference between curricula and pedagogy in your presentation, and it's linked to that. So the question is, you've spoken about the importance of the ways in which these histories are brought into the classroom. But what could be some of the pitfalls of these potentially empowering histories being introduced to students in disempowering or controlled ways? So, for example, learning by rote was mentioned. So I wonder whether the kind of pedagogical aspect could be discussed a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, the consequences are absolutely catastrophic. The idea of the shutting down of dialogue particularly about race, but also about the other aspects that we talked about, real danger of confirming to particularly young people of colour, but also white British young people, if you close down conversations about things, you're in danger of making the topic itself seem to be fundamentally something that we shouldn't even look at. It's too dangerous. And where would those young people go to find out about it? Well, they'd go on the internet. They'd go to YouTube videos that might be fueling nationalist diatribes about migration and so on. You'll lead people down paths that are going to be really unsafe and unhelpful. The idea that young people in classrooms, in secondary or even primary classrooms, are somehow not able to handle these ideas. Well, okay, if they're not able to handle these ideas, what are you doing as adult to actually help them grow and develop? Because media are throwing these ideas all around at them. And so I would say it's a matter of fundamentally of safeguarding and well-being for students that you let them talk about these things.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's almost it completely negates, I think, the work that is being done here when the sort of oppressive, for want of a better word, pedagogies are used to teach them. I'm not sure how you could be talking about some of the sort of more horrific aspects of the slave trade without giving the young people an opportunity to speak to the teacher. There has to be a degree of co-agency, some sort of co-constructivist approach, because this work is sensitive, and there will be sort of complex, classroom dynamics that are, brought from outside society, and the teacher needs to handle that deftly. The only way they can do that is if they're talking to the young people in the classroom in front of them. It's not something to be learnt by rote. It's not something that you shut down. But I don't know. I think there's hope that might be a fashion that will, go in the dustbin of educational history, reappear again in 20 years with a different name.
Thanks so much. Sorry, Matt, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I mean, agree with what Robin and Abdul have said, but we tested a lot of this material with a cohort of teachers from a number of disciplines last year, and some of the big feedback we got from them was really around the barriers that they have found. Particularly, and this was like really engaged teachers who are going out of their way to embed this work and improve their knowledge. So this is like 1% of the most engaged people. Their biggest barriers was time and capacity outside of their core teaching commitments, their core kind of just school management commitments to actually put the time in outside of the classroom, properly paid to develop their own skills, but also develop, curricular school-wide or academy-wide materials. They particularly fed back to us that as great as it is to have, a few sample lesson plans, actually a good teacher with time just needs their general kind of guidance and that textbook type stuff and like your resource material rather than, by rote lesson packs. But, the pinch point again and again and again is that that's not a time and space that schools are able to invest in or prioritize investing in. So if the most engaged 1% of teachers are struggling, the 90-odd% who really this is kind of outside their core skill set and focus, it's tough investment, I guess.
Thank you. The next question is specifically for Rohan, and it's what difference has involvement in this kind of project made to your practice in the classroom as a teacher?
I think what I've got to say kind of builds on the conversation we've been having, which is good in terms of pedagogy and in terms of different approaches to teaching, kind of histories of race and kind of more emotional histories and things like that. I feel like one area of the discourse that kind of tends to get left out when we talk about all the other influences that exist on young people in school today is that for a large proportion of pupils, for example, a large proportion of pupils at the school where I teach, the kind of pre-existing level of cultural capital prior to all of these things being taught is very low. The odds of pupils going on YouTube to look at videos about history, to read about history outside of school is low. It's less about challenging misconceptions than it is about preempting them in the first place, especially I found when it comes to Key Stage 3. I think, if you ask my year 8s at the beginning of this year, hands up if you've heard of transatlantic slave trade, I anticipate maybe 1 or 2 pupils would have been able to put their hand up in a classroom of 30. So I think that area has been the most significant impact on my practice, trying to bridge that divide between pitching, content that's pitched at really quite a high level here, drawing connections between Industrial Revolution, transatlantic slave trade, and then balancing that with kind of time constraints and also constraints on the amount of knowledge that pupils are bringing in is really difficult. And I think finding hooks, things like those images that can have a real impact and make a lasting impact have been really important in my practice this year in particular.
Thank you so much. We've got just a couple of minutes left. There's been quite a few comments about like teachers and teacher response to these projects already, but I think like Robin, I think this question is probably specifically for you in terms of trainee teachers and what are the limitations of training teachers in how to handle these histories, but also what are the opportunities as well?
So what's the specific question, Holly?
So what are the limitations of training teachers in how to handle these histories and what are the opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Rohan's kind of comment there about cultural capital. Obviously, traditionally, cultural capital has had quite a narrow definition in terms of people like E.D. Hirsch and others who really define cultural capital as white middle class culture. and people's kind of people's lack of connection with some kind of canon. I think one of the issues would be a broader concept of cultural capital, and think of people like Gloria Ladson-Billings from the United States talking about culturally responsive pedagogy is actually a shortage of cultural capital between teachers and the young people that they may be working with. And that's not necessarily just talking about students of color in a metropolitan area, but also possibly teachers working with rural working class students. A kind of gulf, I'd say that myself as well, that we should constantly be thinking about the cultural, what cultural capital they have of a different kind to our own, but we all have cultural capital. It's being culturally responsive and culturally competent that is needed, and therefore I think one problem with initial teacher education is the diversity of ways in which that happens. So that there are the university routes, there are the school-based routes, and what has happened with the commonality behind those routes. So whereas in the past there might have been a commonality in those routes that was curricular, so it would be about what ideas should all teachers be engaging with. It's now the language of competencies, and so that the commonality has been reduced to a set of competencies. So what competencies should all teachers be operating? Behavior management, questioning, assessment, rather than what values and what issues should all teachers be thinking about. I mean, we're privileged at UCL to have time in our program in which to allow students to think not just about what they do, but about who they are and how they position themselves as teachers. I fear that in so many routes into teaching, that is just not available. It's not available to the people who are training on a school-based, totally school-based route where survival makes essential the competencies and doesn't give room for the wider thinking.
Thank you so much. I think we've got time just for probably one more question. And I think this is probably for everyone. So the question says, how do you reconcile Black Industrial Revolution with what Sir Hilary Beckles, Barbados historian, said about the reasons for the lack of technology today in the Caribbean as due to history that not a nail is to be made in the colonies. There was no investment in technology focused on manual labour. All the added value was to be done in Britain. That's the way the question is phrased. I don't know if anybody wants to pick up on that. Matt, you're nodding your head. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, when we're like trying to put this focus onto craft skills, industrial skills, and kind of innovation and technological scientific approaches used by enslaved Africans, it is obviously really important to be able to